I'm reading from my book, It's Not a Boy, and I'm reading you the second part of the chapter called Glades. I've already told you about the woodland that I loved, that partly belonged to us, but mostly belonged to Mr. Lordley. And there was a grassy track that led across to Mr. Lordley's part. And you mustn't go in that part because he could prosecute you. And he had a gun. And I was very frightened of him. But even though I was frightened, I still went in his part of the wood because I loved it so much. I was always very careful indeed, though, not to be seen by Mr. Lordley. I hid behind tree trunks, and when I went across that mossy track, I bent double and dodged in the shady patches. And of course, I never, ever picked daffodils that Mr. Lowe had been prosecuted for. Oh yes, the daffodils were still there, because Bill Lowe didn't dig them up. He only picked flowers, and as everybody knows, they'll come again. So I just looked at them, and there they were, shaking their heads and warning me to be careful and never, ever steal them, which I never did. But in a way, there was something that I stole from Mr. Lordley, because you see, the woodland scenes went straight into my head, along with all the birds and the bees that I already knew about and were buzzing there. I could see lovely trees reaching into the sky, and that little mossy track with the sun shining through in patches. I could see it any time in my head, and whenever I wanted to be in the woods again, even if I was in Mrs. Bossy Bantam's class trying to do sums and spellings, I could still see the wood if I wanted. And I didn't think anybody could take you to court for the sights that you steal and keep in your head. But just the same, I didn't tell anybody about it in case I had to pay like poor Bill Lowe. And I didn't tell anyone that I often went into Mr. Lordley's woods either. Sometimes I went on my own, and sometimes all of us went in and trespassed. Our Gwendy came, and Terry, of course, and sometimes Stewie came. Once we had a game of dare to see who could get the furthest up that mossy track. We went creeping under cover of trees and grass, and it was scary in case of consequences. But we wanted to see who was the bravest, and so we crept on and on. And when we saw a big wooden shed nearly hidden by undergrowth, Terry went right up to it. He was always the bravest. It was great fun. But then we looked up, and we saw that we were very near Gumbalding Manor House, where Mr. Lordley lived, and he could be standing there looking out of his window at that very minute. We suddenly got very scared that he would come after us with his gun, and we stood still, not daring to move. "Let's go!" Stewie shouted into the silence, and it was as if somebody really had pulled the trigger, because we all turned and ran and ran. We didn't stop, but we hurtled back to our house with twigs and branches all crackling like shots under our feet. Later, I thought about the shed for a long time and wondered what was in it. Then one day, when I was off school with a cough, Mum let me go out into the fresh air because she thought it would do me good. So I wandered on my own and went into the woods until I came across the track, and I just could not stop walking down it again. I bent double and dodged in the tree shadows, My heart was hammering away in case of guns and Mr. Lordley and his big boys. But I was very careful, and I kept out of the bright splashes of sunlight and kept into the dark patches on the mossy track, and soon I was right up again against that big shed. I forgot all about Mr. Lordley for a few minutes, and I put my hands on the rough wooden sides of the shed and pressed my eye through a crack, and I saw something amazing. There was an old-fashioned carriage with red shafts for a horse and red velvet seats, and I could see the brass carriage lamps on one side. It was a bit like the trap that Brenda's horse, Lucky Basket, pulled. But Brenda's trap was black all over, and it was very little. And this one was huge, with bright red inside. I stared at it for a long time, remembering what Dad had said about carriages driving along the mossy track to the manor house. I thought of rich Mr. Lordley Senior with his posh friends who could afford to sit in a red velvet carriage and ride up that mossy track to a big party. And I thought about poor Bill Lowe, and I felt very sad. But then something even sadder happened, because it happened to me. Not in our woods, but at school. Brenda and most of my class went up into the next class, but I had to stay behind because, as you know, I was not very good at sums and spelling, and that was the consequence for not learning what I should have been learning at school. I had to stay in bossy Mrs. Bantam's class. Charlie stayed with me, but he didn't care. He just laughed. Doreen Lowe stayed with me as well, but she just gave a little frightened smile. Then all the younger kids came up from the huts, and all the same lessons of sums and spellings that I had already heard started again. It was boring as well as sad. Then one day, much to my surprise, something very interesting happened, and it cheered me up no end in class. You see, Mrs. Bantam wanted us all to enter a painting competition for a garden party at Gambalding Manor. We'd done a lot of painting with Mr. Gray, but we never painted with Mrs. Bantam, and she always did sums and spellings, as you know. So this was very unusual. Now listen carefully, children. The Gazette is sponsoring this competition, so there will be certificates for the lucky winners at the garden party. The title of the painting is Glades, which has just been chosen especially by Mr. Lordley. Well, we didn't know what she meant by glades, and so we all just sat still and stared at her. Then she got us organised, and paper was given out to cover our desks. It was newspaper, that's all we had. And then painting paper was given out, and powder paint was scooped into white saucers. There was silence again, and we all sat very still, till Charlie suddenly burst out laughing. He had got news of the world, and there was a bare lady on it. Mrs. Bantam sent him out of class straight away to stand near the taps again. Charlie Fox, as a punishment, you will enter this prestigious competition in your own time and learn some extra spellings as a consequence of your bad behaviour, she bossed. Charlie went out grinning. He never bothered about consequences, And still we waited. We didn't know what to paint. What on earth were glades? Now, children, you will be all familiar with glades in our woodlands. Where there is a little clearing or a little path, there will be a glade with dappled sunshine. Ah, at last I knew what she meant. I grabbed my brush and I started, and I just could not stop. I painted that little mossy track with the oak tree like my dad standing proud and unbending, and my mam the sycamore tree with her sewn on leaves, and then Uncle Sid the beech tree standing up straight and looking out and seeing everything that went on above us all. Auntie Vera was the willow tree in her pretty dress, and she was dancing all over the place. Sunshine tried to get through all the leaves, but it only managed in a few places. I dabbed spatters of white in the darkness of the moss. I knew every bit of that scene. I could see it as clearly as if I'd been standing there in the woodland. I worked all afternoon, and I didn't even have to stop and think. "Well done! That is truly excellent. I had no idea that you could paint so well." That was Mrs. Bantam, and she had said "well done" to me for the first time ever. But I hadn't quite finished. I got some yellow paint, and right at the front I painted 10 little daffodils, just to show everybody that Bill Lowe didn't do any harm when he picked those daffodils all those years ago. Then I looked up, and Doreen was staring at my painting. And then she looked at me and gave a very big smile. Not a weak one like she usually did. It was a great big wide smile which turned into a laugh. So she knew that story of her granddad stealing the daffodils, and she knew why I had put them back again in my painting. I went to the Gundbalding Manor garden party with Mam and Gwendy. Me and Gwendy were all dressed up in some dresses that Mam had made especially for this prestigious time. I just couldn't wait to see who had got certificates for their painting.